Carson, do you know if Alan's going to be here?
No, he's not.
Alan won't be.
Okay. All set. Good morning, folks. This is I'm sitting in for Frank Riley this morning to bring the meeting into order. It's 2 minutes after 10. Frank is absent today, and Alan is absent. Gary?
Here.
I'm here, and Aurora?
Yes, sir.
So we have a quorum. The first item on the agenda is the training for committee members.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Bowman, General Counsel, and with the department. And periodically, we try to do a refresher training on open government for all of our advisory boards, and so it's kind of time for that for this committee. So I'm going to walk you through that, and it's this is probably all familiar to you, but familiar concepts. But we want to just kind of emphasize some of these things that open government requirements that apply to the work of the committee. We're going to cover the Open Meetings Act, the Administrative Procedure Act, and then the Public Information Act. So first of all, the Open Meetings Act. The purpose of the Open Meetings Act is to promote open and transparent government. And it does that by making meetings of governmental bodies open to the public. Also requires that there be public notice given so that the public is aware of the date, time, place, and the subject matter that's going to be discussed in any meeting of a governmental body. One of the key concepts to understand about the Open Meetings Act is a quorum. When you have a meeting that triggers the requirements of the Act, this is a key concept. A quorum is a majority of the body. We have a quorum here today. Another important point about a quorum is that you cannot, a governmental body cannot conduct official business or take official action unless you have a quorum present. Deliberation, this is another important concept in whether you have a meeting that triggers the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. It's a verbal exchange between among a quorum of the governmental body or between a quorum and another person. For example, staff. If there's a discussion between a quorum of the governmental body and staff, even just receiving a report from a verbal report from staff members, that is considered a meeting under the Open Meetings Act. So kind of pulling those concepts together, a meeting is when you have a quorum or majority of the governmental body that deliberates about public business that's under the jurisdiction of that governmental body. If you have a meeting subject to the requirements of the Open Meetings Act, we have to give public notice. We have to notify the public of the date, time, place, and the subject of the meeting. So we prepare an agenda, the staff prepares an agenda that lists all of that information, and we have to file that ahead of time, at least 7 days in advance, with the Secretary of State's office, and we also post it on our website so that the public knows in advance, and if they want to participate in the meeting or be aware of what's being discussed in that meeting, they can do so. A key point about the agenda: the only thing that the members of the committee can discuss in the meeting are things that are subjects that are specifically identified on the published agenda. So we have to stick to that agenda. There are some exceptions to the requirements of the Open Meetings Act and what is considered a meeting. If there are social functions or a convention or a workshop that you all happen to be attending at the same time, that's not necessarily a meeting. And if the only interaction you have with each other is incidental to that social event or convention or workshop, that's not a violation of the Open Meetings Act. You do have to be careful if you're at an event like that to not engage in a discussion of actual committee business or try to take any action on committee business at that time. So some key points to remember. Just be aware of any situation where you might have a quorum present. You have to be very careful, if that happens, not to discuss committee business outside of a posted official public meeting. And then lastly, beware the walking quorum. This is an important concept to know. A walking quorum is where you have members that are less than a quorum, let's say 2 members of the committee, that are discussing business with each other, committee business. That in itself does not violate the Open Meetings Act. But if one of those members then takes that same issue and talks to another committee member, then you have a quorum discussing that issue, not all at the same time, but that's considered a walking quorum and can be considered a meeting in violation of the Open Meetings Act. So that's something that you have to be careful of. And I think we've covered that example. And this can occur not just in person, but it can also occur through electronic means, or through conference call, email, texting, video conference, even a hallway discussion, or on a break in a posted meeting. You know, you can't have side discussions that involve a quorum of committee members that's not part of the public meeting. So the best practices to avoid this walking quorum problem, you should not meet in small groups and discuss committee business and then communicate those discussions to other members, or send email or text messages to all of the committee members. This is kind of a new arena of social media and how that interacts with the Open Meetings Act, but is something to be careful of if you are on Facebook or other social media where other committee members might be participating in a discussion. You have to avoid that, because that could be considered a meeting that violates the Open Meetings Act. And then polling, this is something else to avoid. It's kind of a variation of the walking quorum situation where one member would ask each member individually how they're going to vote on a particular matter. You don't have a quorum together at the same time, but that still is considered a violation of the Open Meetings Act. So for your open sessions, the meeting that you're having here today, again, the cardinal rule is you have to stick to the specific items that are listed on the agenda. There is a public comment portion on the agenda where the public can come up and speak if anyone is interested to do so, and the public can speak about any matter, whether it's on the agenda specifically or not. However, the committee members cannot engage in a discussion of that issue if it's not on the posted agenda. The most you could do, if you hear something in a public comment that piques your interest, you think the committee might ought to discuss, you could say, let's put that on an agenda for a future committee meeting. Some guidelines, again, limit discussions to the specific agenda items in the notice. And also kind of sometimes have to be careful of allowing discussions that start with an item that's on the agenda that can kind of wander off into other topics that are not on the posted agenda. That's something to watch out for, and the staff will also help try to guide those discussions if we run into that situation. And I think we've already covered the public comment issue. What happens if there's a violation of the Open Meetings Act? There are a couple of possibilities. One is there is a civil remedy, an action that is taken by a governmental body in violation of the Open Meetings Act is voidable. And that means someone, an interested person, could take legal action against the agency to try to undo whatever that action was that was in violation of the Open Meetings Act. Obviously, we don't want that to happen. There are also criminal penalties, misdemeanor criminal penalties for violations of the Open Meetings Act. So this just kind of highlights that it is important that we follow these requirements and why we take it as seriously as we do. Just overall best practices, again, just be wary of any time you have a quorum that's together outside of a public meeting, posted public meeting. And again, can't emphasize this enough, we have to stick to the agenda in the meeting. Here are some resources for you, and you have this in your materials as well. The Attorney General's office has a really good handbook. If you're just, dying to know more about this topic, you can read up about it there. They also have a really good training video. And then another good resource is our phone number. So if you have any questions or if you ever run into any situations that you feel like you need some guidance on, please call my office and we can talk you through that.
Good.
Any questions about the Open Meetings Act?
No. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the Administrative Procedure Act. This is another open government statute that does have some interaction with the work of the committee. The APA establishes standards for the practice and procedures that are followed by state agencies. And the part of the APA that we're going to focus on has to do with rulemaking procedures. You have a couple of items on your agenda here today that involve the rulemaking process, and so this is just kind of a reminder of what that process looks like and the legal requirements for it. So the first concept is what is a rule? Any rulemaking has to go through this APA process, but the first threshold question is it a rule? And there's the definition from the statute. It's a statement of general applicability, so it applies generally broadly. It interprets, applies, implements law or policy, or it describes procedure and practice for the agency. However, it does not include in purely internal policies or procedures of the agency. It also includes the repeal or amendment of a rule. So what are some sources for rulemaking or rule changes? This is a partial list. Legislative changes is a big one. If there are changes that the legislature makes to the statute, that will very often prompt the agency to go through a rulemaking process to implement those changes. Sometimes ideas for rule changes originate from the advisory committee itself, or from a work group of the committee, or from staff. May see some issue or problem that needs to be addressed through a rule change. We have also a 4-year rule review. The APA requires every 4 years the agency has to review its rules, and that can also generate rule changes. We'll be talking about that a little more later in the meeting. And then finally, there is a rule petition. An interested person can petition the agency to adopt a rule, and that's a list of the people that can file a rulemaking petition. We have some specific requirements in our rules that a petition has to identify the specific rule change that they want us to make, has to have underlines and strikeouts and be very specific about what that rule change looks like. Okay, this is a kind of 30,000-foot view of the rulemaking process. Just a couple of things to point out. The green boxes are the 2 points at which the advisory committee typically will see a rule. So there's usually 2 looks that you have at a rule before it becomes final. So we start with a draft of the rule. The staff prepares that. Then that usually comes to the advisory committee for your recommendation and review and any comments that you have. After that, we publish the rule in the Texas Register for public comment for 30 days. Then we come back for another advisory committee meeting, and the committee at that point considers all the public comments and will make a final recommendation to our commission on the rule. Then it goes to the commission at one of their regular meetings for final adoption. And then it generally takes effect 20 days after we file that finally adopted rule. So here's a quick overview of the rule review process. So again, every 4 years, the statute requires that the agency has to review its rules. What we do is we file a notice with the Texas Register that we're going through this rule review process and invite the public to make any comments that they have, and that's another 30-day public comment period. We will bring that to our commission, and in the initial stage of the rule review, it's really, you can't make any changes at that point. It's really just a decision of, do we still need these rules? Are they obsolete? Or do we readopt them as they are and then potentially make changes down the road? And that's typically what we see, because we still need the rules. There's still a statute that requires TDLR to implement this program. However, there may be some changes needed. And so what we do is we bring the public comments that we get from that notice, we bring that to the advisory committee for your consideration and any discussion of whether there are changes possibly needed. That would spark a whole nother round of rulemaking if there are changes that come out of that process. Here are, again, some resources from the Attorney General's office for rulemaking, and our phone number if you have any questions on that. Any questions about the Administrative Procedure Act or the rulemaking process?
None, thank you very much.
Okay. Last issue to cover is the Public Information Act. The Public Information Act generally makes information that are documents, records, other information in the possession of a government agency open to the public, and the public can request that information, can request copies of it or access to that information. That's the general rule. There are a number of exceptions to the Public Information Act, information that is confidential, that the agency cannot give out, or information that the agency may seek to withhold for one reason or another. A key point here is that public information can include not just paper records, but any kind of electronic information, emails, information in our databases, as well as files and paper documents. And the Public Information Act is supposed to be liberally construed in favor of granting access to the information. This is a quick overview of the process. When we receive an open records request or Public Information Act request, there is a time frame that we have to adhere to. We're supposed to respond promptly to that request. There's also a 10 business day deadline that is looming. If we're going to seek to withhold any information that may be confidential or not subject to disclosure, we have to act within that 10-day time frame, have to let the requester know, and we either have to write to the Attorney General's office to ask to withhold the information, or in some cases we can simply redact the information. Those are some examples at the bottom of some types of information that we typically see that are confidential or not subject to disclosure. And a lot of that has to do with information about some third party, like a person's date of birth, their personal email address, medical records about that person that we might happen to have in our possession. Those kinds of things are considered confidential, and we would not disclose them. One of the points I wanted to emphasize with you, there some resources again for you for this statute. Any information that you might have in your possession that relates to committee business could be considered public information, and it could be subject to an open records request. So, for example, if you send emails between each other or with the staff that have to do with committee business, that could be considered public information, could be subject to a Public Information Act request. So just be aware of that. It doesn't happen very often with our advisory boards or committees, but there might be a situation where we would have to ask you for any emails or documents you have about a particular matter. Not personal information or personal documents that you would have, but if it relates to committee business, even if it's on a personal device or part of a personal or in your personal email account, if it relates to agency business or committee business, it would still be considered public information under the law and would have to be provided in response to a request. So that's just something to be aware of as public officials. That's just something that we have to live with. So. I'm sorry?
I said I've heard that this happened before up in Washington, didn't it?
I've heard that as well. Yes, I think that's.
It was said.
All right. Any questions about any of those legal requirements?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Good
Thank you.
review.
Thank you.
Excellent. The next item on the agenda is approval of minutes for our meeting back on the 7th of June. Any comments?
No comments. I move that we approve the minutes as presented.
Okay, the motion's been made
Second.
and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The minutes have been approved. Next is a public comment. Do we have any public comment? Negative. Staff reports. Mr. Beaumont.
Executive office first.
Sir.
Oops.
Yes, sir. Advisory board members, I'm Nick Voinas, TDLR Chief of Staff. Thank you for being here today, and again, we appreciate your service. Kind of here to give you a little summary of what's been going on around the agency since you last met in June. TDLR staff is working to prepare for the upcoming session of the Texas Legislature in January. This summer, we completed our strategic plan and our legislative appropriations request. Remind you, those are available on our website for viewing. TDLR has also been busy in participating in interim legislative hearings. Most recently, our Executive Director, Brian Francis, testified at a hearing of the House Committee on Licensing and Administrative Procedures. Prior to that, TDLR presented at a joint hearing of the House Committee on Licensing and Administrative Procedures and the House Committee of Business and Industry. We also testified at a joint hearing of the Governor's Budget Office and the LBB, as well as hearings of the Senate Business and Commerce Committee and the House Natural Resources Committee. Again, all this is in preparation for the next legislative session in January. Also like to talk to you a little bit about our outreach, including your website, and update you on some traffic numbers associated with your program. Over the past 6 months, the weather modification website had 2,561 page views. It's an average of 14 page views per day. 46% of those visitors accessed your site from a desktop computer, while 54% did so from a mobile device, and that's 49% from a smartphone, 5% from a tablet. The top reasons for visiting your site: number one, harvesting the Texas skies in 2018, a summary of rain enhancement operations in Texas, and weather modification advisory committee information. Also want to remind you that we are active on Facebook and Twitter, so if you would encourage people to follow us there to keep up with TDLR news and events. Also wanted to mention that you do have a group of about 3,000 subscribers that receive various email blasts pertaining to this program. And if someone is not receiving those, they can go to our website and subscribe and begin receiving those immediately. I'd also like to introduce to you our new public information officer, and I think George is going to talk a little bit about her as well, but she's Tila Mange, and she's in the back there, and she hit the ground running in a very short period of time, has been a very talented and productive member of our group, and she's been working on with George to promote this program. And,
Welcome, City.
And I'll let George talk a little more about that, I guess. If you have any questions, be glad to answer them. Otherwise, thank you again for being here.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Bomar.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm George Bomar, Weather Modification Program Specialist in the Office of Innovation of the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. I have 3 items I want to cover under staff reports. The first one being the state of the program at the end of the 2018 cloud seeding season. You have a map that depicts where we have target areas currently in Texas. And those target areas cover a little less than 30 million acres, which is about 1/6 of the land area of Texas. Most recently, we renewed the rain enhancement permit of the SOAR program, the Seeding Operations and Atmospheric Research program that's headquartered in Stamford, Texas. The committee at its most recent meeting recommended that that permit be renewed, and we did in fact renew it. And there is in your file a copy of the transmittal letter, which we typically send along with the permit to remind the holder of the permit of the need to continue to renew the license on an annual basis and to keep us apprised of any changes in personnel that are involved with the project. We currently have 6 permitted projects. We have 7 weather modification licensees. The cloud seeding season is essentially over for the year 2018. We have a meteorologist here from one of the projects who will report later on another agenda item, item G, and also a status report from a member of the Texas Weather Modification Association on continuing research into using charged water droplets for rain enhancement. As chairman of the Public Information Committee of the Weather Modification Association, I was tasked earlier this year to draft a new position statement on the environmental impact of using silver iodide as a cloud seeding agent for the National Association to consider at its next meeting in April of 2019 in Phoenix. And I wanted to share this draft with you today. I expect at that meeting in April that the association will ratify this position statement. It will be uploaded on the WMA website. It is a rather detailed response to a number of questions that are typically asked by folks wanting to know about the seeding material that's customarily used in cloud seeding activities in the United States. Questions having to do with how much silver is released into the environment by cloud seeding, and should we be concerned about using silver iodide? And I just want to call your attention to the summary statement that's on the 3rd page of that policy, position statement by the Weather Modification Association. It's 3 sentences long. I'd like to read it because I think it summarizes the gist of what we now know about the use of a glaciogenic material like silver iodide. In summary, a plethora of scientific studies and investigations over a half-century has identified no environmentally harmful effects arising from cloud seeding with silver iodide aerosols. While research on the effects of cloud seeding have demonstrated increased precipitation from treated storms, no corresponding statistically significant systematic increase or accumulation of total silver in freshwater, soil, or in stream, lake, or reservoir sediments in areas when seeding has been documented. No federal, state, or local regulations exist for establishing acceptable levels of exposure for silver iodide, due in part to the fact that silver iodide is generally considered to be insoluble and is thus not bioavailable or toxic. You will recall at previous committee meetings, we've had some folks attend and express concern about the lack of study and investigation into the use of materials like silver iodide. And so I think this new statement that brings to bear all of the recent work that's been done to assess any environmental impact of silver iodide, it will be valuable to have as we respond to various queries and even complaints from folks who believe that people are being harmed by the types of seeding material that are commonly used in cloud seeding operations. And lastly, under staff reports, I wanted to share with you a
George,
couple
I'd
of...
like to congratulate you
Yes, sir.
on the level of detail you put into that report. And I think that's going to do a lot to alleviate their concerns. Where's that meeting going to be?
In Phoenix in April.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. I wanted to share a couple of articles that surfaced since our last meeting. One of them from Esquire magazine entitled Drip, Drip, Drip. It's a lengthy article, and I merely wanted to highlight a few facts about the availability of fresh water worldwide. And I do that because I think periodically we need to recognize the shape that our world could be in coming years if we do not find new sources of fresh water. And it also validates the effort in the state of Texas and beyond to develop and refine technologies such as rain enhancement. We are going to need more fresh water, and the availability of water beneath the surface is becoming more constricted. Transporting water from other places where there's more than needed is still an expensive proposition. There are various technologies that are being examined to see if that can be a piece of the solution. But when you reflect upon the sorts of statements that I just want to cite here, I think it gives impetus to the fact that we need to continue to use the technology we have, the cloud seeding technology that's in place, possibly with new materials that are to be discovered, tested, and found to be helpful, because we are going to need more water, more fresh water, as our population continues to grow. One of the things I want to cite from this article published in Esquire magazine, for decades farmers thought the Ogallala was inexhaustible. The Ogallala is the aquifer that is prevalent in the Great Plains, and certainly the folks in the Panhandle and South Plains of Texas are very dependent upon fresh water out of that aquifer. According to Scientific American magazine, drawing on government studies, by 1975, the amount of water taken each year from the aquifer equaled the flow of the Colorado River. That's not the small Colorado River in Texas, but the big one that so many western states are dependent upon. The article says now the annual draw is about 18 times that amount, 18 times the flow of the Colorado River. Farmers have been pumping out 4 to 6 feet a year in places where half an inch is being added. As far as continuing to be useful, the Ogallala might be exhausted by the year 2070. A reasonable estimate is that it would take 6,000 years for rain to replenish that aquifer. And even more stunning are numbers such as these. 40% of the world's population, that's more than 3 billion people, will be living in areas of severe water stress by the year 2050. It's only 30 years away. The increase in the number of violent incidents spurred by conflicts over water, 450% increase. 700 million people will be displaced due to water shortages by the year 2030. That's only 10 years away. And 842,000 people, including 361,000 children under the age of 5, die each year from diarrhea due to contaminated water or lack of adequate sanitation or adequate hand washing facilities. And so this is a set of sobering statistics that insist we continue to push ahead with developing new technology to find fresh water. It's a very provocative article, and it's certainly worthy of the attention of planners and policymakers. Also wanted to share with you an article about hail cannon use in Mexico, and it's pertinent particularly today because we have on the agenda an action item to renew a permit for the use of a hail cannon network in West Texas. This article is entitled, "Volkswagen Accused of Ruining Mexican Crops with Weather-Altering Hail Cannons." This is an article that appeared in Money magazine a few months back, since the committee last met. Local groups in Mexico around the city of Puebla, which is about 60 miles southeast of Mexico City, a city of 1.4 million people, folks from this area have accused the German automaker of causing a dry spell with hail cannons. The devices are used to protect cars parked outside the factories, and those automobiles are subject to dents from hailstones. A company spokesperson told CNN, even though there is no evidence that the use of these devices causes a lack of rain, Volkswagen of Mexico decided to modify its operation in order to maintain a harmonious relationship with its neighbors. And so Volkswagen stopped using these devices in an automatic mode and is only operating them manually when the meteorological conditions determine the imminent fall of hail. I would say that the use of the hail cannon network in West Texas is not in an automatic mode, but is only used quite sporadically when atmospheric conditions warrant their use. The automaker in Mexico, Volkswagen, says it now plans to install anti-hail nets over more than 150 acres to protect its cars. It said it would continue to use the cannons if needed. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles are produced at the plant each year. I must say that until this article surfaced, I had no knowledge of any hail cannon network being used at an automobile manufacturing plant in Mexico. But it serves to remind us that these hail cannons are very likely in use in many different parts of the world and even in North America, and we're not aware of their use. As far as we know, they're used only in one place in Texas, and their use is licensed and permitted. Mr. Wenas alluded earlier to the addition of our public information officer, Tila Mange, who came to me recently and said, since you're from the Office of Innovation, you might be interested in helping us do a little bit of innovation. And so with her help and with the help of Jeff Copas we recently began doing a little series of Facebook interviews live, talking about various aspects of the weather in Texas. The interviewer is Tila, and the person she had to work with is yours truly. And we wanted to just show you a sample of the sort of live interview that we have done and that we continue to do, talking about various topics related to Texas weather.
We want to make sure that the folks who are watching are able to hear, but George is fabulous. He's really easy to work with. I thought he was going to say no when I asked him to do this crazy thing. We've done 2 so far, and standing on the corner of Colorado and 10th Street, and people just walk by. It's kind of fun. We have another one scheduled for this Monday at noon, so if you're able to get to Facebook, you can get on live and ask questions of George while he's on there. If you miss it at noon, then just get on Facebook and you can find the interview. So I'm going to put this up and start the video.
All right, we're here with George Bomar of the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation at 920 Colorado in the heart of downtown Austin. George, talk to us a little bit about what happened with Hurricane Michael. You know, when you and I talked on Monday, it was a minimal hurricane, and then suddenly when it made landfall yesterday, it was just short of a Category 5. What was up with that?
Well, Michael developed into a major hurricane quicker than most any other hurricane we've ever observed in the Atlantic Basin. Normally, when you get into October, you're on the downwind side of the cyclone season. You don't see storms grow nearly this intense. But there were a number of factors that came together at just the right time in the right place, namely extremely warm surface waters in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the absence of any wind shear aloft over the Gulf. And that storm spun from a barely named storm to a Category 4 hurricane in about 33 hours, which is about as quick as we've ever seen a storm that was benign grow into something really devastating.
What made for the conditions where there was no wind shear that you would normally expect this time of year? Is that normal?
Normally by now the polar jet stream has begun to plunge south and we start getting some wind shear. But this year fall was late in coming. We had tropical heat dominating along the Gulf Coast deep into September. We're just now beginning to see some really significant frontal invasions of Canadian air from the north. So it's not out of the realm of possibility for us to see waters 84 to 86 degrees at the surface in the Gulf of Mexico, but normally by now, mid-October, you begin to see some cooling.
What do you see happening in the next week or so?
Well, our gaze is now turned to the west rather than the east because the Gulf of Mexico is void of anything of significance. The systems in the Pacific are now beginning to turn more to the north. Hurricanes, we've had several that have threatened the Hawaiian Islands this year. Most of the storms that develop off the coast of Mexico in the summer go due west and die in colder waters. This year, though, we're about that time of year when we start seeing those storms turn to the north. And they crash into the Mexican mainland and they spread an immense amount of moisture into the desert southwest and into West Texas, and that's what we're about to see.
I've been hearing rumors there might be snow in the Panhandle this weekend. Is that true?
There is snow forecast for the Panhandle of Texas on Sunday. There's already been the first significant snow in Colorado. That was the day before yesterday. And we're expecting our first really potent cold front here in central Texas sometime on Sunday. It's going to feel wintry here early next week.
That seems a little early, is it?
Not really. Virtually every year, one of the things you can bank on is in the middle of October, we will get something to remind us of what winter is like here. Namely, some really chilly temperatures, and when you throw in some rainwater, it's going to make people grab for their coats, and that's what we're looking at early next week. So it's not really early or late. It's about on schedule.
Do you think that we're going to have any more hurricanes possibly in the Gulf Basin this year?
Oh, I think there's a distinct possibility we'll see some more. In fact, there are a couple of systems out there now that are well out at sea that are not threatening any land area at the moment. Our hurricane season extends to the end of November. We've had named systems even into December before. So even though we're a couple of weeks downwind of the peak hurricane season, we're still in jeopardy.
So people shouldn't feel confident that we're going to skip something here in Texas. We could still have our name on it.
We could still have a system affect us here in Texas, although I will say, once you get into the middle of autumn, when you start getting the polar jet coming south, pushing these fronts into Texas, those frontal boundaries tend to insulate us. For example, that Michael developed off the Yucatan coast. It could have moved west, but it moved due north, and that was because of the way the jet stream is beginning to assert itself now over the mainland of the U.S.
Was there anything else that you want folks to know about our weather here in Texas?
I think this is the best time of year to be a weather observer because you still have the influence of the Gulf. At the same time, you start seeing these systems come in from Canada to bring us some relief.
Yeah.
And we've had some drenching rains recently that has erased the drought in much of Texas, and that trend looks like it's going to continue for a while longer.
So you think that folks that are still finding themselves in drought in Texas may find themselves out of drought?
We're in the rainy season right now in West Texas, what is typically the wettest 2 or 3 months of the year. And with this moisture coming in from the Pacific at regular intervals, some of it due to hurricanes, others due to the jet stream itself, we're in good shape to get some rains to eradicate the drought all over the state.
Thank you very much, George. We look forward to more weather with George later on.
You're welcome.
All right, we got to tune into that. Good work, Sheila.
Tila asks really tough questions. So if you do call in, make sure it's a really simple and easy question.
That's amazing. That's good. And you've gotten a bunch of hits on that and comments and stuff.
Yes, we have.
Sorry, yes, each of the videos that he's done so far has received over 2,000 views. So, at the time, we don't have as many people watching, but then word spreads and people will share it and other folks will watch it. One thing that George didn't tell you is that he actually, I guess, he was an innovator with this because he's the first program. This is the first program that we've done this with, and we'll start doing it with other programs as we come into the next year. But he's been a really great guinea pig.
Thank you.
I noticed you didn't talk weather modification.
We have discussed having a future interview session on that topic.
Good.
I anticipate we
Good.
will. Mr. Chairman, that sums up staff reports under the Office of Innovation. Are
Excellent.
there any
Thank you very
questions?
much. The next item on the agenda is the field meteorologist report.
Good morning, Jonathan Jennings. I'm with the West Texas Weather Modification Association and the Trans-Pecos Weather Modification Association. Since we've last met, the weather's been interesting, to say the least. July, we had kind of a normal operating season in both the Trans-Pecos regions and the West Texas regions, where we were seeding pretty much 8 to 10 days during the month of July. However, we did have one of those easterly tropical waves that impacted our region, and with that comes very low cloud bases, very challenging flight weather conditions. So we had to kind of shut down and wait for some of the conditions to improve a little bit. But then August came around, and we did get started doing some seeding in early August, but again, we had another tropical system that came in from the east, and very low cloud bases, cooler weather, just not your typical summer convective season for West Texas. We had a lot of very low clouds, stuff that it's very hard to fly in. So typically July and August we see anywhere from 15 to 20 operational days. We only saw 11 this year. So after a very slow start, if you recall, we had a very slow spring out there. To add on a very slow summer, our operating days were well below the average. Then we get into September, and things look like they're going to get pretty wet for us, so we start seeding down in parts of Schleicher, Sutton, and Crockett counties. But again, we started, on September 2nd, we started seeding at about 6,000 to 7,000 feet, got down to 5, got down to 4. Next thing you know, we're down to 2,000 feet. And that was it. September 2nd was the last day, because that's when we started seeing the flooding in Schleicher and Sutton counties, moving further to the east in Kimball County and the city of Junction. So with all that rain, I mean, parts of Schleicher County received 15 inches of rain during the month of October, or I'm sorry, during the month of September. The saturated soils, every time it started raining again, because we had numerous consecutive days of rainy weather out in West Texas, the flood warnings would come quick. So, you know, by the time we were even ready to launch, there were flood warnings out there. Plus, with chatting with some of the board members, we decided that we were going to just take it easy, let the water run off. Not really a reason for us to go out there and just cause any more havoc than Mother Nature was already providing. And then October, again, very saturated soils. We had Hurricane Sergio come in from the Pacific. That brought a lot of moisture in, along with the cold front that came from the north, and that stalled out. And there's just so much moisture all across parts of West Texas. We saw another 10 to 15 inches of rainfall across many of the areas. El Dorado and Schleicher County in September and October saw a combined 30 inches of rainfall. Their average is about 21 for the whole season. So some of the wells up there I've heard were going up about 30 feet. The lakes in San Angelo, so Twin Buttes Reservoir, rose 32 feet since September 1st. In fact, it's the first time since 1994 that our equalization channel actually became equal. And what I mean by that is we have two ponds. We have a north pond and a south pond. The south pond sits at a higher elevation, so all that water runs off into the north pond. But the north pond caught so much water that the elevations were equal, and the equalization channel was actually just a stable river, basically. Wow. So the Twin Buttes Reservoir is at the highest level since 1994. Additionally, Lake Ivy, which is just east of our target area, before the rain started, sat at 80,000 acre feet, and it's over 200,000 acre feet now. So the city of San Angelo, they think they caught about 5 to 6 years of water supply from the rains we saw in September, October. The other reservoir is O.C. Fisher. That one didn't do as well, although there was a lot of rain in the North Contra watershed. For some reason, that water just does not run off efficiently into O.C. Fisher, but we still saw a 7-foot rise in that lake as well. So the lakes were doing very good. Out in Trans-Pecos, typically July and August are the slow periods for out there. The convection's kind of confined to the mountainous areas of Culberson County and Jeff Davis County. So we didn't see a whole lot of action, but we ended the season with 10 operational days out there, which is a little below average. We got a little late start again, but we're working with them to get started a little bit earlier next season, and hopefully have a pretty busy spring next year. Any questions about the weather modification operations out there? We had 22 operational days. That's about half of normal for West Texas. The flight hours were about 70. That's about half of normal, but we used a lot of flares. And sitting down and looking at the season as a whole, most days we were out there operating, we could see the response from seating pretty good. I don't know if it was a timing, dosage, the flares, or just the convective parameters that we were having, but it was one of the more successful seasons on a cloud basis that I can remember.
Excellent.
So. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. Next presentation, the accomplishments.
Field meteorologist.
So, good morning, everyone. My name is Quorums, and I'm from the South Texas Weather Modification Association in Pleasanton. The season started off a little quiet. We started to see it in May of this year, on the 20th of May, because...
Just a little bit more going.
Yeah, we started to see it on the 20th of May. We had 33 seeding days. We ended the seeding on September the 6th due to the fact that, we have saturated soils and we didn't want to, add more water and cause flooding in people. Yeah, so the amount of seeding... Okay. So the number of flight hours, 134. The number of flares, 1,433. We seeded 3 days in May. June, we seeded 7 days. July, 8 days. August, 10 days. And September, 5 days. So, so the main factors that contributed to seeding in South Texas was the sea breeze, inverted troughs, cold fronts, and stationary fronts. We had upper level and mid-level troughs, as well as shortwave disturbances. As well as also the reason why we started seeding late, most of the storms that came in they came in like overnight hours, and we normally seed during the day. The fronts also moved in early in the morning, so we weren't able to seed. We had lower cloud bases. It started to pick up really in June and ended as well in July. So we haven't done any seeding in the rest of September as well as this month, because it's really, really wet. Some areas have seed. I mean, especially areas like over the the Medina County and parts of the Uvalde County, there are excess of close to like 2 feet of precipitation in excess. So, as well as areas like southeast, along the coast where we have a lot of sea breeze and tropical moisture coming in, they kind of exceed the limit. But most areas over there, target zones, are pretty much above the normal precipitation for this time of the year. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Craig?
He delegated the duties to me. Jonathan Jennings, West Texas Weather Modification Association. Dr. Dan Martin wished he could be here, but USDA has put him to work this winter, so he's pretty busy. Anyway, as far as the research goes, it was reported back in June that we were going to use one of the aircraft, Piper Comanche aircraft, and the transformation was successful. The only issues with that is we were limited with the amount of water we could carry. However, we were able to get 30 gallons of water on that aircraft, and everything worked well. So we were able to continue the research. One of the challenges was that the previous year, the USDA provided the pilot, provided the airplane. This year, the West Texas program did that. So it was kind of challenging balancing when to do the research versus when to do the operations, because we had to make sure the operations were taking place, and not only taking place, but taking place efficiently. So that was the biggest challenge, but despite that, we were still able to get about 10 hours of flight time with the electrostatic spray plane. And most of the days were kind of marginal. Again, we didn't have a normal season where we could go get those single cell convective thunderstorms that have, really good sample clouds next to it. However, we did have one case down in Schleicher County where we targeted a storm in western Schleicher County with flares, with the plane with the flares, and then the storm in eastern Schleicher County with the electrostatic system. And we saw great responses from both of those storms. However, the response with the plane, or the storm with the electrostatic seeding that was taking place was far greater. Not as far as intensity goes, but longevity. So the storm we seeded with flares lasted about 40 minutes. The storm we lasted with the electrostatic system continued on for about 2 hours. Wow. So it was a really good case, and it kind of mirrors what took place the previous year. So we were seeing similar results. But there are some differences with the electrostatic plane that we're using now versus the one USDA provided. So we're just going to continue, finding the clouds, continue the research. We have a plan for next season to get even more clouds seeded. And we also will have an earlier start because the airplane's ready to go and already converted. So we feel good where we're at. I think another season or 2 seasons will get us to the cloud threshold we want to get to start doing some reports at conferences and stuff. So we're moving forward, and I think we're proven to be quite successful so far.
Wow. Did you expect longevity as opposed to density?
The
difference?
Yeah. Going back to 2 years ago, we didn't know what to expect. And the first several storms we seeded 2 years ago, that's the main thing we were seeing was the longevity in the storms. Yeah. And we're still not quite sure why we're seeing that. So this year, that was one thing we were looking for, is are we going to see that same response as far as longevity? As far as the intensity, we do see a peak of intensity at the peak of the cloud's lifetime, but it's short-lived. But we think that we're having an impact on that, and it's not actual rainfall. We think it's more about the seeding, droplet size that we're using. But we're very young in this research phase. We're still trying to figure all this out, and we have a meeting in January where we're going to sit down with Archie and go over the analysis real well and figure out why we're seeing what we're seeing and what we could do to do a better job, or maybe we're overseeding. We don't know yet. But we do know that what we're doing is proven to be quite successful.
Outstanding. We'll be looking forward to another report from you next meeting.
Great. All right. Thank you.
Item I is discussion and possible recommendations regarding the proposed amendment at 16 Texas Administrative Code, etc.
Hello again, Brad Bowman, General Counsel. This is a proposed rule that the committee has seen before. At your last meeting, the committee recommended publication of this rule in the Texas Register for public comment. We did that for a 30-day public comment period. We did not receive any public comments, so today we are recommending that the committee vote to recommend this rule for final adoption by our commission. As a reminder, this rule was addressing a finding made by TDLR's internal auditor. By practice, staff had allowed ground-based weather modification operators to report on a quarterly basis as opposed to a monthly basis as specified in the current rule. And the auditor's finding was that we needed to document that process. And so we've done that with this proposed rule. In addition to that, we've also allowed an option for the programs to report the required information on a publicly available website in lieu of sending a report to the department. So it kind of gives some added flexibility to them on that, in addition to allowing some public access to that information. So with that, I will leave it to you. We'd be looking for any comments or questions that you might have on the rule.
No, I move that we make a recommendation to adopt the rule as presented.
Move's been made and seconded, and all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. So done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
I think I have the next item as
Yes.
well.
A discussion and review of 16 Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 79.
As I mentioned to you in the presentation earlier, the Administrative Procedure Act requires that all state agencies review their rules every 4 years and determine whether those rules are obsolete, are still valid, whether any changes are needed. We have a schedule for doing that, and the Weather Modification Program is up for that review. We have published the notice of the review in the Texas Register for public comment. We did receive 2 comments, and those are provided to you for your review. I won't go into detail about them. I will note that they seem to be raising more general concerns rather than pointing out anything specific about the rules that they would want to see changed. The next step in the process, this is really kind of an informational or discussion item for you at this point. There's no action required here today. The next step in the process is we will, at our next commission meeting, ask the commission to readopt the weather modification rules without any changes. There is the possibility, as part of this process, either from the comments or from the advisory committee or staff, there could be changes that result from this process down the road, and that would result, if that were to happen, that would require a separate rulemaking process, kind of starting that whole process over again, drafting those changes, publishing them for comment in the Texas Register, and so on. At this point, we really don't, George and I were talking earlier this morning, as far as the staff is concerned, we really don't have any changes on the horizon that we're looking at. So unless the board or the committee is interested in exploring that, there's not really anything that we would be recommending to move forward with at this time.
Based on a lack of public concerns, I'd say press on. You got it under control.
Okay. All right. Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Brad.
All right.
Item K, consideration of possible recommendations of application for renewal of health suppressive permit for building farms.
Mr. Chairman, George Bomar again. There is one weather modification project in Texas that does not use aircraft for modifying a certain aspect of the weather, and that's the hail cannon operation of Belding Farms, which is a large orchard located about 10 miles southwest of Fort Stockton. Belding Farms has held a weather modification license issued by this agency for some 20 years. They have renewed their permit at the 4-year interval. The permit under which they've been operating is due to expire in January the 20th. And so we have an application before us from Belding Farms to renew their hail suppression permit for another 4-year period that would take them through January of 2023. I recently visited the project, and you have before you several photos. I don't know that I've ever shown you a hail cannon before, But this is the hail cannon. Actually, there is a network of some dozen or so of these hail cannons located on this on the property owned by Belding Farms. This is a vast pecan orchard. It covers 2,200 acres. And the farm is dependent upon irrigation water. It uses pumps and power plants along with a delivery system that consists of concrete-lined canals and underground pipelines. It routinely records water well measurements and uses a soil moisture probe to monitor soil moisture levels and aid in scheduling irrigations. So it's quite a sophisticated operation. The cannon network is usually deactivated in October of each year. The pecan harvesting begins right after the first killing frost, and that happened on Tuesday of this week. It usually takes them about a month to shake all of the pecans and gather them, and then processing follows in usually beginning about the Christmas season and ends in late January or early February. I recently went through storm data to try to document how many hail occurrences there have been since the turn of the century in the vicinity of Belding, which is a tiny community about a mile from where this orchard is located, in order to try to determine could these hail cannons possibly have had an effect in ameliorating the intensity, the frequency of occurrence of damaging hail. And what I found was, since 2000, there have been 18 hail incidents in the vicinity of Belding. That's about one per year. For all of Pecos County, and as you know, Fort Stockton is the county seat, situated pretty much in the center of the county. In the last 18 years, there have been 141 hail events throughout the county. So less than about 12% have occurred around Belding, where the farm is located. With one exception, hail has always occurred between 2 o'clock in the afternoon and sundown. A third of those events, or about 6, had hailstones that were 1 3/4 inch in diameter. That's golf ball size hail. Another third had hail the size of nickels. And interestingly, all but 4 of those 18 events occurred in either May or June. The earliest in March, one also in April. So their window of hail likelihood is quite small, which means, as their reports have documented over the years, these hail cannons are not used in the late summer or in the autumn, certainly not in the winter, and rarely used in the spring. Almost exclusively in the months of May and June. The manager of the farm, Glenn Honecker, told me that the most recent harmful episode where hail occurred at the farm and did some damage to the pecan trees occurred on Palm Sunday of 2004. That's 14 years ago. Large hail caused extensive damage, even though the farm had the hail cannons at the time, but the reason they were not used is the hail occurred before dawn on Palm Sunday, catching him and plant personnel off guard. And by the time they got to where they could activate the hail cannons, much of the damage had already been done. It's the only incident in which they've had damaging hail in the last 18 years. The hail was the size of golf balls, and in and around the farm, it accumulated to about 3 inches in depth on the ground. So a very rare occurrence. Again, the Hale Cannon network could not be activated in time. And I asked him about wintry weather and whether the Hale Cannons would ever be used in the winter, and his answer was no. He said the only episode that he could recall was in the early 1980s, when they had an astounding 18-inch ice and snowstorm that shattered virtually every tree on the farm. But he said the trees did recover. So I thought that kind of information would be interesting, particularly the picture of the Hale Cannon as well as the farm, the neatly arrayed rows of pecan trees that extend for as far as you can see in all four directions. It's quite an operation.
Must be beautiful.
And personally, I can understand the investment in a Hale Cannon if over 18 years you've had only one ruinous episode, and that occurred in the middle of the night when the Hale Cannons were not operating. Now, as we've said before, it's not the charge of this committee or the agency to require a permit applicant to demonstrate efficacy of the proposed weather modification methodology. We're only required to examine the operations plan and how the weather modification activity is going to be conducted in order to ensure that people and property will not be adversely impacted. And we've certainly not been able to determine the deleterious effect of any Hale Cannon operation. So what we have before us is the application for a new 4-year permit. The permit fee has been paid by the applicant. The notice of intention that we require be run in newspapers in the area has been reviewed and approved. The notice will soon be run in the Fort Stockton Pioneer newspaper. They have also provided proof of insurability, and so the application is before you for a recommendation today.
Okay, I move that we recommend approval for the renewal of the permit for building forms.
I second.
Motion for recommendation for approval has been made and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
George, did they shoot the cannon for you?
Yes. And you want to wear earplugs if you're within about 100 yards of the Hale Cannon.
Well, I think you did a good job in proving that it works. We ought to have a
Well,
meeting out there.
I wouldn't say that there's proof that it works, but there is evidence suggesting that somehow, some way, an area that's saturated with hail cannons seems to have less hail incidents than in other areas nearby. That's what the data have shown.
Well, thanks for putting that data together. Okay. Recommendations for agenda items for the next committee meeting.
Mr. Chairman, George Bomar again. The next permit that will expire belongs to the Panhandle Groundwater Conservation District, and that permit does not expire until January of 2020. We have no permits up for renewal in calendar year 2019. So until we renew licenses next summer, I don't know of any action item that the committee would be faced with until mid-year of 2019. You can certainly choose to meet sooner than that. We may have another updated report from the researchers.
I'm going to suggest that we meet sometime late in the summer of 2019, or are we required to meet more frequently?
There is no requirement in terms of how often
Is that
you need
enough
to meet.
time to permit the research to have some additional data to report to us?
If I may suggest, the month of July would be opportune in terms of renewals of the 7 licenses. we should have those applications in by that time, and we will also have been back in the field with the spray plane, having hopefully gathered a number of case studies.
The spray planes will have had some action by then.
Yeah.
July sounds like a good time.
Rest assured, it will not be this cool in July.
No. Okay, then we'll stand by for your recommendation for a hard date and time.
All right?
And you know how to get a hold of us.
Okay.
Anything else? Then I'll call the meeting to a conclusion. It's 11:24.